Yesterday, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg released his roadmap to enact all of the recommendations directed at the government from the Banking Royal Commission, and they've said it is fast-tracked. Joining us to discuss that is the Shadow Financial Services Minister, Stephen Jones. Thank you so much for your time. What do you make of the assessment from the Treasurer that this is a fast-tracked response when most of the recommendations will be enacted through legislation by the end of next year?
Certainly anything but a fast track. I mean, yesterday Josh Frydenberg turned up and said, "I'm sorry, but my homework's late." His so-called roadmap is simply nothing more than seeking an extension on getting his homework done. Frankly, a little bit disappointing. We'd like to work with the government to ensure that we can move forward on the recommendations. There are some big gaps in what they've published yesterday. One that I'd like to point out is something that we should be doing immediately, something we can do as soon as Parliament gets back, is implementing the recommendations that the Royal Commission made at 3.4 and 4.1 to ban the hawking of insurance and superannuation products. You know, Annalise, some of the most heart-wrenching evidence that we saw in the Royal Commission was that footage and the soundtrack of the young Down syndrome boy who was sold a life insurance product that he could never have understood and probably didn't need. And it's exactly those sorts of heavy-handed hawking, heavy soliciting practices that the Royal Commission said we should be banning. We agree. Before the election, we produced a private member's bill which would have done exactly that. We'd encourage the government to work with the opposition to ensure that we can outlaw these practices. I mean, nobody wants to get a phone call interrupting their dinner, trying to flog them anything, let alone a life insurance product. So let's move on this one. And in many other areas, we think we can bring forward the agenda.
I will return to that hawking provision one in a moment because that is interesting. But just on this point of fast-tracking, the point that the government is making is they've said if they didn't put that $9.3 million to hiring more Treasury staff, if they didn't bulk up the number of cases that were being handled exclusively on enacting the Banking Royal Commission recommendations at Treasury, it would take many more years than just to the end of next year. So is that not fast-tracking?
Oh, look, we're really not going to give the government credit for fixing some of the problems that they made themselves. I mean, cuts to the public service, not just Treasury, but in ASIC and the other regulatory agencies, have hindered their ability to not only do their job as regulators, but respond to the Royal Commission's recommendations. And you know, these are actually a long time coming. It's not like they popped out at the beginning of this year and surprised everyone. This was a long time coming, and the government should have geared up a lot earlier. Like I said, we're not trying to be obstructionists. We're actually trying to facilitate a cooperative approach with the government. I've identified too that we could move on almost immediately. There are some other areas with goodwill from the sector, goodwill from the government and the opposition. We could see a fast track of the implementation timelines. We're willing to meet the government to make this happen.
So on that point of the hawking of insurance products that you were speaking about just before, the issue that has held this up in part has been the reaction of the regulators. They needed ASIC on board to be changing those laws, and it was ASIC that was taking it out for public consultation. It was ASIC saying that when it was an explicit recommendation of the Commissioner that just ban it, he wasn't mincing his words. So is this not just part of the process of having to bring everyone with you to make sure that you have properly drafted laws, that they are airtight and that you do have everyone on board?
No, this one's not rocket science. Yeah, we have introduced legislation over the last decade to ban hawking of shares and other sorts of financial products. It's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward. We can do this. The industry knows it's coming. This is not going to come as a bolt of the blue, out of the blue from the industry. They know it's coming. And I can't see any justification. There might be other areas where perhaps a more consultative process with some really complex legislation where, you know, a bit more caution might be needed. But on this, it's pretty damn straightforward. And why do we need in excess of 12 months to implement the legislation, to introduce the legislation, and probably another 12 months after that to implement the legislation? The delay is unacceptable, and I go back to that evidence that we heard in the Royal Commission, and in fact the evidence from the industry themselves, who say they find it very difficult to see how you can do a lot of this heavy-handed selling whilst complying with the existing laws. So the recommendation is straightforward. In fact, you mentioned ASIC's disposition on this. ASIC did a report on this over 18 months ago. They're well prepared for the sorts of legislative changes that need to be put in place. I think it's a clear win. A win for the government, a win for Australia, and certainly a win for vulnerable consumers. Let's do it.
And if we turn to one of the other major topics of the day, we know Cabinet today is considering these draft laws about protecting freedom of religion. Do you think that there is a risk that in drafting these laws and putting them through, it could be impinging on the rights of others? And the perennial example is the gay teacher in a very religious school not being able to show how they live their life.
Look, I've always said we should be very, very careful about what we hope for in this area. I don't think there's an Australian who would seriously say we should not cherish and protect our right to practice our faith, or not practice our faith. We live in a multicultural society, a multi-faith society, where we have for years and years and years respected that right. But we don't want to be going down a path where we're fixing a problem that doesn't exist. And we don't want to be going down a path that creates unintended consequences. So if the government has got some proposals which modestly protect faith communities, people of faith, from the sorts of discrimination that we all would find abhorrent, then that would have our support. But if we venture much beyond that, we are creating some significant difficulties for ourselves. And as others have commented in the past, we do want to be cautious that we don't want to find ourselves in a space where we're creating a one subject matter Bill of Rights whilst ignoring all the other legitimate claims from the rest of the community about the rights that they'd like to have protected within law. And I think it was that in mind that the Attorney-General, Christian Porter, said we should be very, very cautious about what we hope for here.
One of the suggestions, and we haven't seen these draft laws yet, they haven't been released publicly, but we do understand that one of the things that's being considered is an exemption for religious groups from defamation law. Do you think that's fair, that you should get a privileged position because you are a person of faith about what you can say about other people as opposed to those who wouldn't be? Yeah,
look, I find that very, very difficult. And I've got to say to those who are advocating this, we've got to be cautious. If we're trying to put in place those sort of arrangements, then it's very, very difficult to resist a call for reciprocal arrangements, which apply both ways. I mean, in other areas of freedom of association, for example, we protect the rights of people to associate, to belong to unions and other organisations, as well as the rights of people not to do that. And it'd be very, very difficult to resist calls within the community to do the same sorts of things in this space. So I think we'd want to be careful. I'm not attracted, obviously you'd look at the detail, but I'm not attracted to those sorts of exemptions that are being talked about in that example you give.
Stephen Jones, always a pleasure. Look forward to talking to you next week as well.
Great to be with you.